Today on 7th Circle Gaming, we're continuing our series of games that we'd considered for analysis in the past, but for whatever reason, decided to look at something else instead. Today, we're going to finally be analyzing Elden Ring. We'll get into the analysis proper in just a moment, but of course, we will begin with the full disclosure, and as always, you're welcome to pause the video and read through all of these if you like, but if reading isn't really your thing, just let the video run. Moving on to the gameplay footage, we do hope that you will forgive us for not discussing the overworld map of the game, but we decided to forgo that because we couldn't find a way of discussing the overworld map that wouldn't reveal story spoilers. So instead, you're getting extended looks at the in-game world. From what we can see in this in-game footage and the previous footage, the world of Elden Ring is a high fantasy world rendered in a fairly realistic art style. We also note that the user interface is restricted to the corners of the screen, leaving the majority of the play space free to render the in-game world. At the top left-hand corner, we have our character health indicator. At the bottom left-hand corner, as you saw very briefly there, is the inventory indicator. At the bottom right-hand corner of the screen is the notification bar, and at the top center of the screen is the in-game compass. And that's all the gameplay footage we have to share with you on this particular video, so we're now going to move on to our first proper chapter, which is immersion as it always is. Here, Elden Ring has earned a score of 9 out of 15. The game seems to rely primarily on presentation, player agency, statistics focus, and challenge for getting players immersed into its in-game world. The game does exhibit a story which may appeal to some players, although that does not seem to be the game's primary focus for creating immersion. Moving on now to difficulty, where the game has earned a score of 3 out of 15. And this was a particularly difficult subject for us to discuss because, well, almost anything that we could say about the game is baked in, if you will, to the Dark Souls genre and completely expected. On the other hand, it is an excellent opportunity for us to point out that here at 7th Circle Gaming, we only count positive points toward a game's score. Negative points do not count for or against the game, they are only included for your reference. Moving on now to lasting appeal, where Elden Ring has earned a score of 6 out of 15. Please note that this does not include Night Rain, as we consider that to be a standalone expansion rather than a downloadable content or DLC as it is defined. This leaves the primary reasons for playing the game through to story and a second, third, or even fourth time, being those enumerated above, apart from seeing if the story changes any depending on the choices the player makes. One last thing that we want to mention before we move on to the overall score is that the game does have a number of different activities for players to engage with. However, these do not become available until the player has reached a certain point in the game. Overall, Elden Ring has earned a score of 6 out of 15. But how can that be, we hear you say, because well, the game has an overall very positive rating on the Steam storefront, and furthermore, it is considered to be the finest game in the Soulsborne genre to date. There are two ways of looking at that. The first is to say, well, it's a niche game and end the discussion there. However, it is the second possible interpretation of that score that is why we've chosen to analyze Elden Ring at this point. So, if you will get out a handful of salt and indulge us for a moment or two, we're going to talk a little bit more about those things that make a game good that are not necessarily objectively quantifiable. For some players, it is the world design and the creature design. Nothing else quite scratches that itch. For others, it is the challenge presented by the genre, although more precisely, it's the satisfaction derived from overcoming that challenge that appeals to them. Finally, there is player perception, and this is something that applies to any game, not necessarily Elden Ring. Players are more likely to perceive a game as good if they think that they are doing well in it, rather than doing poorly in it. And that is something that Elden Ring does very good over other games of the Soulsborne genre. Because it has an open world design with a variety of creatures for players to combat, and those creatures are not necessarily challenging, it does provide players with a feeling of doing well in the game early on. As much as we would love to engage in a very, very long discussion about the psychology of gaming, we do have some additional questions that we want to answer. So, let's move on. The first of those questions is Elden Ring easier or harder than other games of the Dark Souls genre? Of course, these are only going to include the core From Software Dark Souls games. And to answer that, we're going to say no, it isn't. However, it does, as we just finished saying, give players the perception that they're doing better earlier on than other games of the genre do. Should you use a walkthrough or a gameplay guide when engaging with Elden Ring? The answer to that is no, but also possibly yes. Because keep in mind that any walkthrough or gameplay guide is going to be subjective and direct you to play through the game the same way that the person who created the walkthrough did. On the other hand, it may contain valuable information about the optimal levels and optimal things to use when engaging with the game. On the other hand, over-reliance on a walkthrough or a gameplay guide can create problems, as it leads players to believe that any playthrough that does not accurately reproduce that of the walkthrough creator is somehow wrong or incorrect. Our final question for today, and our final highly subjective answer, is should Elden Ring be your first game in the Soulsborne genre? To that question, we are going to answer emphatically no. In our opinion, your first game of the Soulsborne genre should be Jedi Fallen Order. It's a much more approachable game, and it has the added benefit of being part of an established science fiction franchise. It's also more likely to be on sale for any number of different reasons throughout the year than other core games of the Soulsborne genre. And on that final highly subjective note, that's all from 7th Circle Gaming for today. But now it's your turn. You're welcome to express any opinions that you have about the video you just watched in the comments section below. You're also welcome to suggest a game that you'd like to see on the channel down there too. If you liked the video you just saw, go ahead and give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more of these highly objective videos, and until our next one, from 7th Circle Gaming, goodbye.